Ikole ngambulo luku with whatever we do. Yoni safu nola with whatever we do. Hale yide munyu skula nyepamne ne kudlukula nyepangiragala gena nyepamne ne kudlukula ibuloke numoto ni beti sola ibuloke dato ni betoto
Bege Congo
Lamin
na
Lamin te jibe norin te nyame Lamin
kabana wulo kono
nyinta mo Lamin
pabilenki
muna ngata afamole
hayna
ngata Ngoto le Fabrama
Mingi Baba Nyola
Ngoto le Fabrama
Namu jumara kan kuma diten
Fabrama
jumara mu
ndele bare muso
Nunda mana Jamani mbere
Lindo ko
jamani
bari ngoto man kontande
bari jamani fana na ramu man kontan
ngoto minaka ngalamin je fon filitala lamin jibe nori nyala
lamin ila siran sama ne benki yala so tol sayni no ko ngol ko momo
ngoto
nam
iterinte yalo ne lamin hakilo diata bake karamu ngoto anu santeng ministry ko di ngole si suko na amanke ko do holi de
si bitun
bagona de
ala ni ko kede namo balo
ala ni na ko na karta bulo be dam ala ni je
ngoto
nam
ngoto mon kontan fere
jamani mu ne keda
ifika lamin ki wulo ko no nyinta mon ko do fete malo lamin nyanta sila la be la moy kala karango
jamani karamu be soron ne ko fasita wulo ko nako
baba
karambu wol ma soron ni ko karamu wol soron da amanke ko holiday lem ngoto dindi wo nyanta sila la ala karango la moy yamen kamen fue man kontan anda mande
alla nyin kombo kurang adanda la kombo len do la jankara mol soron do kamen kurang ma ra do kombo e ko ndol fanena kara mol soron je kara mol soron lamin ada lo nyino la man tara fe na sokon ala mu nekela
am lamin ide fete malon ko lesinol be ke kar radio to
nga fine
e ko nyani mo lamin
nga fine
ya mu na fonye
bi kabin mina kan tambita nteri maning fatu tambite la sukol ala dinol bebe siri be la moy ka
faru dan so am fana tambira jele ni subala la ngaje dinni ngol be jet talanta nen kili waro e be serin jelet
sa lamin farante ku kili wo ke no la ba lamin bita ka wulo ko no nyin taymo alami
amandara fennela
ite dine ko di man si yakari la sino la moy radio to e balon na
mu ne ka ke afende ba nyaara ni alon
telentel jikot
afende ba mu ne be ke
ite balon tel be jikritel ni man karambe ku kele yaaje nata karana mbasa mala ya itarije
par nyaaran mo kurang ho findira kombo ide na rajede ni sonka bay ko lamin ma nyaata la wulo ko karam mo be so da fa ne membe
ko to wole nati bawo ngalle ni lamin kuntala kombo kurang e ka fa me kombo kurang asototal wala kinay ko e sisu kono bari ni ko e sisu kono be karangol dike la radio lin telel to hani tele masoto to nyaay man tele soto la bongo bar radio be bulen koto batiri sanga ay si ay alamo
sa do kala nyaadi
ko ta o bulaji
ado kala nyaadi
kamun ke nyaadi
radio abe wala mo la be mo na falaje
karandirol kala jele
titalle be radio ko men ka karandirol
ila subjectol baby jele baby jele
wala nanga coco moy fa dan so wolya ngombe tambi kana ngadi ni wolje be ikadum bungo de ko kada
ma asototal de
la min mala be karawala de
bari laftalal ideal on ko inde every year second wala fourth
muna ni ko di ha ko nde ko folle sinila mba ndele sinilo ne ba
mba say mba foke en koto wole fango yen wulindi yalo famo keta bat yin fana bulata ko ko me yen nati jambi la min nyanta karana ndel be jiko be nyineka ya bulay kara wulo kono ta kilar ya bambalo yo be bulaje koto dinni ngoy si ayala le sino la moy radio
wora ka munda kara mo man soro la men nyana kara si so na radio
la sila le ayala le sino
dal ko korno ko smalo
kilar ya
be ngala ko momo sa mi do ni ko no kera
mengi bruzo
ndelo ko ro la ba rosa no radio ba no bari woro radio ni abe je le ba ngamra do man dembe buljan dala nyara nyar wora bu ko fendi mo la tan tayra ba rosa
bara te ku folo ajibe nori nya labi tamete ku
teku
bari ko do famo ke
imagine nani nyambol si zol le keje kisigi man si zol no le kafun ka nyoma bari nyambu kilo ni manya na kafindi ni nambe ko zol la ga
ngalle limbeta de be nyambo do dilanna
nyara ni ko ridin fennat nyara nata
bari famo ke da
ngata bungono tambi bungono nyara ngando ko fele ko ke baru nganda ni pelo landi jak
iyo awa dar la
bisu diara
pendulala ye fongo tanka sina dulu tanka korota korota
Hello everyone. Welcome to another history lesson. My name is Sheikh Tijan Sise, your usual presenter. The topic today is effects of the transatlantic slave trade on the Gambia. This is a continuation of the previous lesson on the transatlantic slave trade. Before I talk about the effects, let me just give you a brief recap of your previous lesson, the Gambia and the transatlantic slave trade. In that lesson, you looked at the origin of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the organization of the trade. In the organization, you are told that the transatlantic slave trade was also known as the triangular slave trade. And it was called the triangular slave trade because the voyage took 3 stages, from Europe to Africa, Africa to America, America to Europe. Having said that, I don't need to say much on it, so I come straight to the effects of the transatlantic slave trade. One of the effects of the transatlantic slave trade was loss of life and the population of the Gambia. Many able-bodied men and women lost their lives during the transatlantic slave trade. Some were taken away to the New World, and this led to the unpardonable destruction of the human resource and the population of the Gambia. This was very, very serious. Of course, we have seen during the transatlantic slave trade, every year thousands of people, Gambians, were shipped from the Gambia to the New World. And this led to massive loss of lives and the depopulation of the Gambia. Today, we are seeing the consequences of that. 2, destruction of property. Many towns and villages were destroyed. Wars which accompanied the trade caused a great deal of misery and hatred among Gambians. One of the means by which slaves were captured was intertribal wars and raids. One community can raid another community, and the victors will enslave the weak and sold them as slaves. So this led to the destruction of towns and villages in the Gambia. 3, the transatlantic slave trade retarded development in agriculture. The raids and wars promoted an atmosphere of insecurity and social unrest, which further hampered agriculture, which is the backbone of the Gambian economy. Of course, during the transatlantic slave trade, agriculture came to a standstill. Most of the able-bodied men and women were taken as slaves. So as a result, there was the atmosphere of wars and insecurity promoted social unrest in the communities, which made people not to be able to go to their farms and cultivate crops. Point 4, many farmers deserted their farms either for fear of being captured as slaves or purposely to engage on trade in humans, which was considered as a more lucrative business. Yes, in those days, people preferred to capture others, their fellow human beings, and sold them as slaves because it was a lucrative business by then to the indigenous people. They preferred to do that instead of going to their farms, and this led to shortage of food. Hunger and famine was the order of the day. 5, local or internal trade too was affected along the River Gambia. Many local traders preferred to engage on slave trade, which was regarded as a more profitable enterprise, instead of focusing on legitimate trade in goods. 6, development in local industry was also neglected. Most craftsmen and women who could have engaged on the development of local industries like weaving, carving, pottery, leatherwork, iron, salt, soap, etc. were either killed or taken away during the transatlantic slave trade. So you can see today we experience a lot of problems in the local industry. This is why our local industries were not developed, because those carvers, those leather workers, the salt producers, the soap makers were all taken as slaves during the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade also retarded the growth of arts and culture in the Gambia. It demoralized the culture of the people as it promoted the culture of greed for wealth, dishonesty, brutality, and hatred among Gambians. This was also another effects of the Atlantic slave trade. One positive impact of the trade was the development and growth of some states. The trade led to the growth of trading posts like Barra, Albreda, Jufre, McCarthy Island, which subsequently developed into towns and commercial centers. Another positive impact of the trade was the introduction of new food crops like cassava, maize, etc., in the Gambia. So far so good. These were some of the effects of the transatlantic slave trade. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this marked the end of Section A in history. History syllabus is divided into 3 sections, Section A, B, and C. So Section A talks about the Gambia up to 1800, and Section B, the Gambia in the 19th century, and Section C, the Gambia in the 20th century. So in short, this is the end of grade 10, which is the Gambia up to 1800. This is the abolition and suppression of the transatlantic slave trade in the Gambia. As I said, this is the beginning of the Gambia in the 19th century, from 1800 to 1899. When we talk about suppression here, we are looking at how the slave trade was abolished. Reasons for the abolition of the slave trade. The steps taken by Britain to abolish the slave trade, as well as the effects or impacts of the abolition of the slave trade. I mean the transatlantic slave trade in the Gambia. I want to draw your attention to the fact that abolishing the transatlantic slave trade in the Gambia was not an easy task. It was definitely a very, very difficult one. This was true because the trade brought huge profits to the people who engaged into it. Example, the rulers, the slave dealers, the middlemen. The rulers gave their blessing into the trade. As a result, they were accruing profit from it. The slave dealers also bought the slaves at very cheaply, or they were exchanged for cheap commodities. They took the slaves to the New World and they made huge profit from it. Likewise, the African middlemen, they too benefited greatly from the trade. So as a result of these huge profits made or accrued from the trade, it was not an easy task to abolish it. There were many reasons responsible for the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. Some of them are stated below. One, when we talk about the reasons, we can make mention of religious reasons. Many people believe that the slave trade was abolished because of religious reasons. The Christian missionaries preached against the evils of the slave trade in the Gambia. They believed that all men were born free and equal. It was therefore against the concept of Christianity and a crime against God for man to enslave another man. This was the position of the religious bodies, the Christian missionaries. But the question one has to ask was actually the slave trade abolished because of religious reasons? Taking into consideration Christianity was in existence before the introduction of the slave trade, and the slave trade lasted for over 300 years. Where were the Christian bodies at that time? All the same, should have the belief that according to the religious bodies, the slave trade was abolished because the Christian missionaries believed it was a crime against God. Another reason that led to the abolition of the slave trade was humanitarian reasons. Men like William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, Zachary Macaulay, Thomas Farewell Boston, and many others believed that the slave trade was a crime against humanity. They were very instrumental in condemning the trade as an inhuman act by man against his fellow man. So because of this reason, the trade was abolished. Another formidable reason that led to the abolition of the slave trade was economic reasons. Many historians believe that the main reason for the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was economic. The introduction of the Industrial Revolution in Britain was a fundamental reason for the abolition of the slave trade. The demand for slaves drastically reduced as slave labor became outdated because work which could have been done by slaves is now being done by machines in a faster pace. Of course, this is true. Many historians believe that, and even myself standing in front of you as your teacher, I believe strongly that the slave trade was abolished because of economic reasons. Because the discovery of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the use of machines that replaced slave labor, the work which slaves could have done for days or weeks or months is now being done by machines. So as a result, slave labor became outdated. The industrialists no longer needed slaves because they have already got their machines. So slaves became unproductive in the mines and cotton plantations. As a result, they advocated for its abolition. The Europeans, what they needed at that time was raw materials like groundnut, cotton, to feed their industries. They thought it wise to seek raw materials and markets in the Gambia than to seek for slaves. So this was the main reason that led to its abolition. They needed these raw materials to feed their industries. They already have the machines, the technical know-how, the technology to manufacture primary products or primary goods into secondary goods. So as a result, they no longer needed slave labor. They decided to advocate for its abolition. So many historians, as I said, believe that the slave trade was abolished because of economic reasons. Because Christianity was in existence during the time of the slave trade, and the trade lasted for over 300 years. It did not condemn it. Now I move to another subtopic, that is the steps taken by Britain to abolish the slave trade in the Gambia. Here, when we talk about the steps taken, we are also talking about the methods used by Britain to abolish the slave trade in the Gambia. Britain signed the Asito Agreement with Spain in 1713 to supply slaves to the plantation owners in the New World. Henceforth, Britain became the leading suppliers of slaves. It is also important to note that Britain, that championed the abolition of transatlantic slave trade, also championed the supply of slaves to the New World. What I'm trying to say here is the Asito Agreement was an agreement signed between Britain and Spain. And this agreement empowered Britain to transport slaves from the Gambia or Africa in general to the New World. And this agreement, since signed in 1713, Britain became the leading suppliers of slaves in the New World. In the Gambia, they established trading centers like James Island was established by then, purposely to ship slaves from the Gambia to the New World. Other centers like Janjanbureh were also established. St. Louis and Gore in the Senegambia region were also established. So by 1713 or after 1713, the Asito Agreement, Britain became the leading suppliers of slaves. Here, the same Britain that championed the supply of slaves to the New World, the same Britain that championed the supply of slaves to the New World, also championed the cause to abolish the slave trade. In 1807, Britain, the British Parliament, decided to pass a legislation that outlawed slave trade and declared it illegal for all British subjects. Since the Gambia had been recognized by the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1783 as British possession, the Abolition Act of 1807 therefore made slave traffic in the River Gambia unlawful. Now we can say that the first method or step taken by Britain to abolish the slave trade in the Gambia was the Abolition Act of 1807, enacted by the British Parliament. And this law made slave trade and slavery illegal for all British subjects and in all British territories. So since the Gambia by then was recognized by the Versailles Peace Treaty as a British possession, the law also took effect in the Gambia. So slave trade and slavery activities in the Gambia became unlawful. Now, another method used by the British to outlaw slave trade activities in the Gambia was the Court of Mixed Commission. Ships found with slaves around James Island were arrested and taken to the Court of Mixed Commission in Freetown. The establishment of the British Anti-Slave Trade Squadron in order to make the law effective, the British Naval Patrol ceased to enforce the Atlantic Slave Trade Act. They set off in a vessel called the George under the leadership of Captain Moore from Goree Island to the Gambia to catch British subjects still engaged in the trade. The Court of Mixed Commission, as I said, was established in 1819 in Freetown, purposely to try cases of slave trade. Now, before that, when the Abolition Act was passed in 1807, the British Naval Squadron was also established and took effect on the 1st January 1808. One of its responsibilities was to patrol the waters of the River Gambia, and any ship caught with slaves will be arrested and taken to the Court of Mixed Commission in Sierra Leone. Another step taken by Britain to abolish the slave trade was the signing of reciprocal share treaties. These were friendly treaties. If you don't call them reciprocal share treaties, you can also call them friendly treaties between Britain and other European nations. The British endeavored to persuade other European nations to support the anti-slave trade policy in the Gambia through the signing of those treaties. For example, Spain and Portugal signed short treaties with Britain in 1816 and 1817, respectively. As I said, these were friendly treaties that were signed between Britain and other European nations. After the Abolition Act was passed in 1807, other British nations, European nations rather, were not affected by this law because to them, the law was only meant for British subjects and their territories. So they were not complying with the law. As a result of that, Britain decided to sign the reciprocal share treaties, which were also known as friendly treaties, in order to put an end to the slave trade. Well, establishment of Court of Mixed Commission, I think I have said much about it. Ships found with slaves around James Island were arrested and taken to the Court of Mixed Commission in Freetown. As a result of the loopholes in the reciprocal share treaties, Britain negotiated and concluded the equipment treaties with other European nations. According to the equipment treaty, any ship found along the river Gambia with slaving equipment such as ropes, handcuffs, chains, and guns could be arrested and convicted. Spain and Portugal also signed this treaty in 1835 and 1842 respectively. You will take note that, or notice that the reciprocal share treaties were not helpful at all. Many slaves lost their lives. Thousands of slaves lost their lives because under the reciprocal share treaty, if your slaves were not found in your ship or boat, you are okay. So the moment they saw the anti-slave trade patrol team approaching, they will throw all the slaves in the seas. So by that, thousands of slaves lost their lives. So Britain realized that the reciprocal share treaties were not effective at all. So they decided to introduce the equipment treaty. Under the equipment treaty, even though ships or slaves rather may not be found in your boats, hence there were ropes, handcuffs, chains, guns found in the boats or any slave equipment, your ship will be arrested and be taken to the Court of Mixed Commission. Really, the equipment treaty proved to be successful compared to the reciprocal share treaties. Another method or step taken by Britain to abolish the slave trade was the founding of Bathurst in 1816. Of course, Bathurst, one of the reasons that led to the founding of Bathurst was to abolish the slave trade or to stop the slave trade in the Gambia. Bathurst was founded in 1816 as a step by Britain to abolish the slave trade in the Gambia. Since James Island had been destroyed or ruined during the Anglo-French trade rivalry, the British evacuated themselves from the island, I mean James Island, to Banjulu Island, which was more strategically located at the mouth of the river Gambia. This was mainly to put a stop to the slave trafficking in the Gambia. Of course, James Island is far, far away in the north bank of the river Gambia. It was a very small island, and it was not very much conducive to abolish the slave trade in the Gambia. If the British want to champion the abolition of the slave trade, they need a well-strategic location. And Bathurst was seen as strategically located for that purpose. So the British decided to conclude a treaty with the then King of Kombo, Tumani Boja, for the purchase of Bathurst. So Bathurst was established in 1816, purposely to serve as a base for the abolition of the slave trade. Another method used by the British to abolish the slave trade in the Gambia was the declaration of a protectorate in the interior of the Gambia in 1888. The Gambia was declared a British protectorate in 1888. Well, of course, even though the Abolition Act was passed in 1807, there were many loophole activities in the interior of the Gambia. Some of the African kings in the interior, or chiefs, did not comply with the Abolition Act. So because of that, Britain thought it wise to declare a protectorate in the interior of the Gambia in 1888. Even though the slave trade was abolished in 1807, it was still carried on in the protectorate by men like Fode Kaban Umuya and others. Musa Molo was also part of it. Most of the powerful kings, Mansa Brunkai Sonko of Bara was also another big-time slave dealer. Even for the Kombosila was also engaged in the activities during the Soninke Marabouts Wars. People who did not accept Islam on the spot were sold as slaves, even though the slave trade was abolished. All right, point 8. The British also encouraged legitimate trade for the people to divert their minds from slave trade, which was seen as an evil act. Legitimate trade was introduced as a means to encourage people, Gambian people, to divert their attention from slave trade activities. Trade in goods was introduced and encouraged by the British. Yes, there were also many Christian missions established in the Gambia. The Christian missionaries also contributed greatly to the abolition of the slave trade by preaching against it. Christian missionaries like the Society of Friends or Quakers formed anti-slave trade associations to fight against the trade. Some Christian groups challenged cases of slave trade and slavery in courts. So we also have to commend the efforts of the Christian missionaries in the fight against the slave trade, as many or different Christian bodies were established in the Gambia, like the Society of Friends of Quakers, the Anglicans, or the Church Missionary Society, and the Methodists or the Wesleyans. They all collectively fought against the abolition of the slave trade in the Gambia. The British went to war with some local rulers who were still engaged on the trade after the Abolition Act of 1807. A good example was Mansa Brunkai Sonko of Bara. I have made mention of him, that he was one of the powerful slave dealers in the Gambia. And even Musa Molo of Fuladu was also another slave dealer in the Gambia. Likewise for the Kabadumbuya. So the British went to war with some of these rulers in order to put an end to the slave trade in the Gambia. Okay, finally, Fort Bullen was also constructed as another step to abolish the slave trade in the Gambia. Of course, you know the location of Fort Bullen. It's not very, very far. It's just at Barra Point. And one of the reasons that made the British to establish Fort Bullen was to stop the slave trade along the River Gambia. This was why the agreement was signed between Mansa Brunkai Sonko of Para and the British in 1826. And that agreement led to the construction of Fort Bullen in 1827, purposely to abolish the slave trade in the Gambia. Now I move further to the effects of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the Gambia. When we talk about effects, we are referring to the impacts or results. Better still, you can say consequences or outcomes of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the Gambia. I also want you to note that the effects of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the Gambia are different from the effects of the transatlantic slave trade in the Gambia. These are two different things. The previous one I treated refers to the results of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. This one refers to the effects of the abolition. So there are two different things. The first one, effects of the transatlantic slave trade. Technically, they are a bit different. This one, effects of the abolition. Now, some of the effects are as follows. One, the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade or slavery led to the founding of battles, thereby encouraging links with the British. Western education and civilization were promoted. English was taught in schools, and the language became the official language of the Gambia. Okay, right. This one is similar to one of the points I made mention under the effects. That Batos was founded as a result of the abolition of the slave trade. One of the reasons was purposely for it to serve as a base for the abolition of the slave trade. So the founding of Batos in 1816 led to the introduction of Western education and Western civilization. These things were promoted in the Gambia at that time. And the introduction of Western education led to the English being the official language of the Gambia. Two, the abolition of the slave trade led to the rescue and arrival of free slaves from different parts of West Africa. These people brought their cultures with them. Example, Egugu, hunting, and Oje were introduced in battles from Nigeria and Sierra Leone. Of course, in one of the previous lessons, we talked about the coming or arrival of the Akus and their cultures. So this ethnic group came about in the Gambia as a result of the abolition of the slave trade. And point three, the abolition of the slave trade made many of the merchants from Gore and St. Louis to settle in the Gambia. Of course, if you look at Batos at that time, after the founding of Batos, some of the merchants and the Wolof people from St. Louis and Gore were brought to Batos. Point four, the abolition of the slave trade led to the introduction of new types of food. Apart from millet and rice, which were the traditional foods in the Gambia, some people, especially the Aku or Okumarabu as some of them known, also introduced other different foodstuffs like fufu and plasas, other foods like gari, agidi, and egusi were all introduced. Added to that was the use of Western type of dishes and those of the indigenous people of the Gambia. Point five, the Creoles, known as the Akus, who came mainly from Sierra Leone, were repatriated slaves from England, Nova Scotia, and the West Indies. And some were settled first in Freetown, then in Batos. There were also free slaves who were determined to improve their social standings. Many of them became civil servants, soldiers, and teachers in the colony of the Gambia. Many of the Creoles or Aku became traders. They maintained their links with their mother countries. People of the Gambia were introduced to legitimate trade, which also witnessed the formation of British and French farms or companies like the CFAO, the Morel and Proms. All these were farms established as a result of the abolition of the slave trade. The Aku or Creole also was linked to the English language. The Aku language had many words and phrases from many West African languages, especially Yoruba. Aku is a combination of African languages, some on one hand and broken on the other hand. The adoption people also came about as a result of the abolition of the slave trade, like John Mary Cole, Johnson Coker, etc. Adoption of foreign dress, marriages, naming ceremonies, festivals also came about as a result of the abolition of the slave trade. The abolition of the slave trade led to the gradual takeover of the Gambia by the British, because it was deemed necessary that the Gambia should finally be occupied by the British. And this was why they declared a protectorate on the hinterland of the Gambia in 1888. It further led to the decline of traditional industries, as many Gambians largely depended on European imported goods. So far, so good. We have to hold on till another lesson. I thank you very much for your attention.